Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hermetic Tradition, and we will essentially take a look at the deepest essence, or at least one of the most important core principles of Hermetic and alchemical symbolism that has nothing whatsoever to do with interpreting the images, obviously in a literal material sense. This is the point of alchemy, right? Always remember that they were told at some point this was understood in practical terms, right? Like that certain materials were seen obviously as owning certain characteristics that, since think about even the older scanning of the eras according to metals from gold to iron and so on, and that, as we've seen also in a recent video about the, for example, meteoric iron and how this connected with the celestial tradition, arms and armor, knightly culture, etc. Like there was obviously a commixture, right? But when we read, especially in early modern literature, we have to be a bit careful about to understand the deeper essence of essentially, it's as if alchemy had a chemical and sort of natural, at least intended in a post-traditional sense, language that, however, always refers to a higher principle that, in this sense, in early modern terms, is masking the former tradition and its spiritual me, right? These, say, the same alchemic tradition obviously had very ancient roots that already explain, as we'll see now, with many ancient sources, like more or less what this mechanism is, but it was also reaggregated, so very alchemically speaking, in later times, different ways, right? And therefore, you don't have quite to take literally like this information as straightforward instructions for laboratory chemistry, like blending metals and elixirs in a physical crucible, or as if they were merely decorative allegories for ethical virtues or psychological states that require no radical upheaval. Just yesterday I made that Q&A when I was asked firstly, like, how do we actually get there, right? The question wasn't really explicitly about the wall thing, but it was essentially a connection with the patterns, with the traditional sort of ritual practice. How do we rise back to that? And I explained it essentially on Schwerpunkt. I still haven't addressed this in a specific sense. There are some secret rituals that we manage to historical reconstruct through actual text, because actually the possibility of doing so through mere sort of theory and archaeological basis basically null, right? I will talk more about this methodologically because it's a huge issue. This was also explained, I'm sort of not into that stuff, but in historiography on neo-paganism, right? The most sort of straightforward conclusion is that we will never be able to reconstruct practically how certain mechanisms work in most cultures, especially the ones that attract more attention. This is a completely different topic. If anything, it is way more useful instead to learn from this tradition, because as we've seen, it was fundamentally universal, right? But also profoundly self-sacrificial, right? You can't simply follow a smooth line as if nothing was. Everything works on the basis of a real mechanism and of a real function that requires a much higher spiritual elevation, but also physical trauma to a degree. If we want to say, but this is not a masochistic thing per se, but remember the self-sacrifice, and what we will especially discuss today always comes from the apparently counterintuitive sense of having to evoke the forces of the darkness to be able to tame them, which is not merely a sort of abracadabras kind of attitude. Is mostly like a massive effort and essentially practically suicidal trend, if we were to speak in conventional sense. Now, these symbols are meticulously layered, of course, intentionally cryptic pointers and initiatory signposts that direct attention toward one singular extraordinarily intense transformation of consciousness, right? This is not an abstract insight or a gradual intellectual realization. Indeed, again, most of today's, yesterday, now that I think about it, I haven't explained how, for example, war was always the place of election for this divine transfiguration, right? Today, for obvious reasons, like we mostly tend to get there from through an intellectual path, which is not, let's say, wrong or incorrect, but it is less likely to generate the result, right? And what we know from tradition is that this action was sort of direct, lived, embodied experience, so overwhelming in its power and totality that it utterly dismantled and it dismantles, because this is descriptive of metaphysics, at all points in history, and annihilates the ordinary, conditioned sense of self, right? We haven't sort of insisted too much on this aspect. Alchemy takes a step further. You never have to sort of fall into the frequent and apparently only dualistic, heretical. Some of these texts were literally written by people who embraced those doctrines that also, Protestantly speaking, had really severe problems with the entire concept of attainment by Catholic works and so on. So your agency was annulled. This is definitely anti-traditional. So you have always to watch out to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, to be able to contextualize all these authors. And so when you look at the everyday I, that bundle of personal boundaries, emotional attachments, biographical narratives, accumulated memories, egoic defenses, illusions of autonomy and permanence, rigid thought patterns, and protective psychological armor, well, you realize that tradition calls you to completely dissolve this, to reduce to zero, which doesn't, to erase without remainder. And this is a very delicate step, because as we'll learn now, it isn't a matter, and that's where you have to be extremely careful not to fall into Gnosticism, right? And the same goes for Christianity, because Christianity is an inherently Catholic religion, of the many that existed also before it. And many people today essentially exchange it for, okay, you have to nullify yourself, you have to humiliate yourself, to mortify yourself, but in a completely self-destructive sense. This is essentially what Catharism, what dualistic heretics believed, also because, for example, they denied Christ's incarnation there, whereas we know, Catholically speaking, that, of course, Christ won and transfigured in the flesh as well, as God, and sort of, well, let's keep sort of the ultimate point of that, why humanity, at least in the moment, is not immediately transfigured and so on. The point, which, as you know, is an explanation, it's basically God that wants to keep humans partaking to the glory of transfiguration by their own achievement, Catholically speaking, which is also, in fact, incompatible with the notion of sort of only sort of, not much only faith and only scripture, but properly the idea that without God's grace, you can't do anything, as if there wasn't a connection between the two things, as a matter of fact. It's not that it's easy, like this is an unequal relation, all right? But if you look at tradition, you realize that the greater people at the time were considered to be also more parity toward God in their action. And so this solution, which is also the key word here, is not much, again, simply destroying yourself, but be able to overcome all these mechanisms that basically you create in order to protect yourself, because you're essentially scared, whereas you should be able to embrace the greater spirit of the universe through getting its entire force and commanding it yourself as it's present in potential within you, right? And so all these other things basically vanish, because think about how attached you are to them in everyday life, and how this basically derives from the fact that at some point you will get old and die, right? And there is no, it's all about a sort of materialistic struggle against the sacred principle of thermodynamics, and if you take it only in materialistic sense, you're going to fail, because that's what physics tells us, right? Except tradition speaks of spirit as well, that is one also with matter telling the truth, but in this sense has a transformative power, transcendental one. So in the wake of this obliteration, what arises is not a repaired or improved version of the old self either. At least this is also especially what alchemy stresses. but a transpersonal, awakened field of pure awareness that transcends all ordinary human limitations of individuality, duality, and finitude, because the ultimate point should be divinity as well. So regarding this, as you know, in tradition, there is a heaven with some levels, and so it's not merely a matter of becoming God, it's also like surpassing the sort of the merely earthly dimension and basically winning over the second death by being judged to earn a place in heaven, closer to God, the more sort of capable you were in that sense. And so it's only, in this sense, you maintain some characteristics because you're not 100% perfect. And so it's actually not much about transcending yourself as if you had just to, I don't know, do something in this world for it, transcending yourself in order to be God yourself. And in between, all these characteristics of yours, as we'll see now, will become instrumental and functional because essentially your greater fears are also the reason, in a sense, why you develop so much in other ways, right? And so there is a complementary, but the recombinatory or properly fixing mechanism that transcends that same part of yourself. You have to be able to let go. And we know how difficult it is to let go when things actually get bad and we have to make an effort. There, all our limit feels and we feel so weak and powerless and whatever. But at the end of the day, tradition says if you really want to show you have massive attributes, you have to be able to go past that and you will actually get the reward. This is what the entire tradition actually says. This tells you also how also pre-Christian religions, fundamentally, the great Catholic ones, the universal ones, are all in complete, perfect line with Christianity, theologically speaking. In this transformed condition, consciousness is no longer something one, quote-unquote, has or possesses as a personal attribute, right? Because this consciousness is actually commensurate to that same limit, but in this sense is in its transfigurational potential infinite, right? And so in front of that personal dimension disappears almost. It still exists, though. It's very important also for what we said about the works and grace. And in fact, it can be the cause of the same grace, or at least by divine reward, according to the doctrine of the two natures. And so we're looking at so when you look at even just a tool or mental content, it's not what we're looking at in terms of that condition. Rather, consciousness itself takes full possession of the being, permeates it entirely, and remakes it from the ground up. One of the most evocative images recurring across the tradition captures this paradox precisely. A mighty tree struck by lightning, right? Or as the Vedas says, for example, as a moth into the flame. So something that is violently burned, destroyed, sacrificed, purified, if you want. In an instant, the bolt shatters its structure, incinerates branches and bark, leaves the form in ruins, yet the tree remains standing, continuing to burn from within with an inner divine, unending fire that does not consume but illuminates and sustains an entirely new mode of existence. And this is also the principle of sacred fire in its deepest meaning. Naturally, some physicists of you will say, well, but they are basically energies being wasted. There's not really an actual elevation. Well, if you stick to just that interpretation, and the fact at least that tradition says something opposite is at least worth noticing. All right, I will not pronounce myself either on the matter because actually you could actually even make the case that it's sort of physically or metaphysically compatible for what we have still to discover. But there's a very precise reason for that, but I will not explain it in this video in particular. Now, this is the archetype of destruction as well, that is simultaneously the birth of indestructible presence, though, right? It's the idea that if you self-annihilate, you will actually absolutize your power. This radical prioritization of lived participatory transformation over detached conceptual knowledge or doctrinal study find its clearest ancient precedent in the Hellenic mystery traditions. We discussed this in the video about the woman, and we'll, in fact, today stick in part to that as well, because we made multiple turns, but the last one about the hero conquering the woman. And we've seen there, especially in the Eleusinian rites, were actually not among the most sort of Uranianly sort of explicit, but they're otherwise explicit in historically documentary sense. So that helps us understand much of this mechanism that, again, was understood as universal even for those who sided with the chthonic element, with the Pelagian element, or whatever. And interestingly enough, later alchemy openly and enthusiastically endorses this principle at the same time. Actually, there are also many other sources talking about this. The entire, again, traditional sort of sense of spirituality and quote-unquote religion, even though that the latter is not properly the best one, basically states the same. And the most famous articulation appears in a now lost fragment of Aristotle himself, quoted and preserved by Synesius of Cyrene, Cyrene if you prefer. We are in late antiquity, 370, 430. And Synesius was a remarkable figure. He was a Neoplatonist philosopher. Neoplatonism at the time was, really rocking hard, deeply steeped in Plotinus and Porphyry. Synesius was a Christian bishop who retained strong pre-Christian sympathies, by the way, and an author whose surviving works include philosophical treatises, hymns blending classical and Christian motives, and letters that reveal his effort to synthesize the two worlds as well. Right? I have something coming also Neoplatonism. It's radically important to appreciate. Now, according to Synesius, Aristotle, in this now lost fragment that we know because of him, declared that those who approached the mysteries did so in Greek oumatein ala patein, that is, not to learn but to suffer / experience, interestingly enough, so something that calls mostly to direct sort of conoscitive process. The first infinitive mathein, by the way, derives from the verb manthano, that is probably to learn, to understand, which traces back to Proto-Indo-European roots, to think, to mind, to remember, right? The second pathein is the aorist infinitive of pasco, to suffer, undergo, experience, to be acted upon, receive an impression, right? So it's metaphysically speaking, it's not even like you can't, again, reaccess that through intellectual means, but it's not merely as evocative and powerful as that. You really have to invest yourself in it. This is the most important thing of all. And this is linked to roots conveying profound passive endurance or being deeply affected from within, that instead are most traditionally understandable as an active, say, endurance, right, of something that, yes, you're going against in the moment, that you're going to be strongly affected by. So anything, even in Latin, like the concept of the passio and so on, is fundamentally just this struggle against the same mortality, right? The passion of the Christ and so on. Now, the contrast could not be sharper. The mysteries were emphatically not schools for gathering facts, memorizing dogmas, or achieving intellectual mastery. They were arenas of total immersion where the participant was expected to undergo a visceral, soul-shaking ordeal, to be inwardly wounded, broken apart, profoundly impressed, and ultimately remade through direct, unmediated personal involvement. And the Eleusinian mysteries actually were already a very diluted form of all this, because most of what this tradition referred to were the sacred war bands, where people were literally chosen individually and cut to pieces every once in a while to reinforce the concept that you belong to God, and so you were part of a mystical body, and one more, one less was irrelevant, because as we've seen, the personal dimension was completely surpassed. And this can't be applied to every kind of broader group, because nor these war bands or the Eleusinian mysteries were sort of big enough to conquer the world, but something like Romanity, for example, did that, etc. Now, this is initiation in its purest form, at least in concept, the symbolic yet experimentally real death of the old self, followed by rebirth into something greater, with no option for remaining a spectator, critic, or theorist on the sidelines. All expressions drawn from traditions intimately connected to Hermeticism as well, whether Helleno-Egyptian, the magic papyri, the same Gnostic cosmogonies, that regardless again of their errors were still indicative of how still in antiquity that power was, because the Gnostics were siding with a destructive element at the end of the day. But still, by revealing what it says, it can show you how that is eventually crushed by the higher concept. In fact, these Gnostic cosmologies, as we'll see now, are actually quoted by heresiologists, so actual Christian apologists and theologians that were exposing them as false, and or at least highlighting all the sort of terrible character of this demonic, chthonic, telluric element. The same goes for early alchemical fragments that we have, later theosophical visions, that must be read strictly through this experimental participatory key as well. Any at least purely intellectual metaphorical reading misses the point and renders the language inert, right? If you just say, okay, well, this is it, but I'm not going to live by it, all right? You can't actually even get it. This is when, like even von Clausewitz says, you can't have people who actually understand war, but once on the battlefield, they wouldn't have the guts or the head in particular to actually follow up on their knowledge, right, and do the thing. So it's a very interesting combination. Take, for example, the striking phrase, water that gives shudders, frikton udor. Here we will be talking a lot of Hellenic words from the sources we will see now. And so this would be the shudder-inducing water. You know that udor is the term in classical philosophy, in Hellenic philosophy, to define Syntalis of Miletus, the primordial waters, right? So something you find in the Genesis, you find also in the birthed or saved from the waters. We talked abundantly about this in recent months, looking at the role of the feminine chthonic principle in the subordinated, although necessary role it has in sort of the hierarchy of tradition. So this is a shudder-inducing water, a terrible, horrifying water, because it's truly the most horrible principle, the most scariest, the most devastating. So the one that actually undermines potentially any other structure, but that is exactly what you have to defeat in order to control. And that's why, again, we have seen the symbolism of Artemis, Diana, the Luna essentially, and the same Virgin that is the transfigured soul from the fury, from the darker demon that she was once she is finally tamed and possessed by the hero, and she becomes the splendid angel that takes the same hero to heaven, right? And the term comes here from frikton, that is to say, probably causing shuddering terror and udor water. This is preserved. This is important. It's preserved, the source, in the great magical papyrus of Paris, a massive 4th century AD Helleno-Egyptian compendium of ritual magic that syncretizes, in fact, sort of Egyptian, Hellenic, Jewish, and other Levantine elements into hundreds of spells, invocations, and procedures. The adjective frikton that we talked about before stems from, also, it's important to understand in the original language, because today to us it's just like be able to translate from ancient Greek, but also in ancient Greek there is a deep semantic that is worth appreciating, because that's how they understood these words at the time. People who wrote this stuff were very cultured. In frisso, there's a verb that stands for to shudder, to bristle with horror, to have one's flesh creep or hair stand on end. Like that's the degree of terror, which also in Latin literally stems from the land, right? From the terra, from the most chthonic element per se. So the darkest, the grimmest, the one of the dead, of decomposition, as a matter of fact, of the swallowing monsters, the great matter, evoking, in the sense, a purely instinctive physiological terror response as well, which is the most animal-like, the one that the elevated being does not have. While the noun udor, as we said before, descends directly, so water from the ancient Proto-Indo-European vodor, that is to say, built on the root ved, wet water. This is emphatically not a symbol of gentle cleansing at all, right? Think about all those, sending vibes, kind of, natural religions. I believe I'm not a religious person. I don't really like Christianity, but I believe in the Mother Earth. Like these are the lesser people, the foretestators, the slave races of our world, right? Exactly that. Nature wants to destroy you and will destroy you, as a matter of fact, because we are mortal, and so nobody really understands how you would worship Mother Nature, if not as a complementarily antagonistic element that can be transfigured by your own paternal, virile, properly noble Uranian power and accomplishment, right? So it's not like, again, spiritual refreshment or mild ablution. This is the worst thing ever. All the thalassophobic ideas you can imagine reversing like an entire ocean over you, right? Contact with this water provokes primal animal fear. We said it overwhelms every layer of psychological protection. And that's why it's important here, because it can become the instrument to destroy any of your fear and so your mortality. But it can also kill you, for that matter, right? And you have to be strong enough to properly not to fall into the trick. So the protection forces the soul into radical dissolution, at least in this crystallization that echoes, in fact, the inferiorization, the narrowing down of the greater spirit of the higher nature, stripping away illusions and structures in a single terrifying plunge. A closely related image emerges in Hippolytus of Rome's Philosophumena, also called Refutation of All Heresies, Book 5, Chapter 19. This was composed around 222-235, right? Where the early Christian theologian and anti-heretical polemicist quotes from the Gnostic and related sectarian texts to expose and critique them, right? So now we will essentially look at what the Gnostics thought, as described properly by Hippolytus, and so we will understand, as we said before, how even this terrifying nature of it is understood as the one that you're battling against, even as a Christian. It says, "Tode skoteinon udor esti phoberon," right? Which is to say, but the dark water is terrible / fearful. The darkness, right, is a terrible water, if you prefer. So the parallelism, the metaphor is incredible. With skotos, darkness, shadow, gloom, rooted in Proto-European darkness, in fact. Phoberon, terrible, dreadful. So phobia and generating, that's the point, inspiring flight from feeble might to flee in terror. So that's interesting because it speaks also of an actual escape, of an actual route in battle, basically. From the Proto-European bag, that is to run away, to flee. And in those military cultures, you understand how your honor was lost, basically, if you fled, right, instead of standing your ground, and that, because that was seen as the only thing that could also earn you heaven, even in that, to that space. Not enough to win battle, because there were many other heroes from the other side say that had one broken your ranks, but say if you could stand, you would, at least for your own space, for your place in heaven, for your bed in heaven, as we've seen also in the video about the Crusades, earned that, importantly enough. Far from passive obscurity, this darkness is depicted as an active, sentient, intelligent abyss that deliberately draws divine light into itself, swallows it whole, and transforms it utterly. Submersion here is total. No remnant of separation, no lingering surface identity, no dualistic remainder survives intact either, right? So this is also very interesting from a Gnostic perspective, because if this is truly so destructive, like there isn't even properly another of course, the Gnostics understood it sort of would have flipped in the other way around, but metaphysically speaking, they were literally talking about the matter in that case, and so how dangerous it was, which is inconsistent and coherent, in fact, with probably the Catholic vision. Now, in the same section, same source, 514, Hippolytus records another description of primordial, quote, entire power of violent agitation, similar to water always in movement, a force that, quote, bears what endures, frees what goes, destroys what grows. And according to Wu's likeness, certain mythic Titan-like figures, such as Cepheus, Prometheus, Iapetus, were supposedly fashioned. Remember how even, figures like the typhoons, all the the giants, the titans, those wouldn't make it into divinity because they could summon this, but were not able to defeat the Uranian gods, are considered also very much connected with this natural chthonic dimension, right? In all tradition, for that matter. This is also no static element, but a ceaseless, turbulent, dynamic principle that at every moment simultaneously upholds existence through endurance, liberates by severing bonds and attachments, and annihilates whatever attempts to harden into permanence, thus permanence in a lower state, so thus perfectly mirroring the eternal cosmic rhythm of creation, preservation, and destruction of the impure that underlies all manifestation. This is also, as you understand, as water, no static element, but a ceaseless, turbulent, dynamic principle, because it belongs to the becoming par excellence. So it's also an illusion par excellence, all this fear, right? Watch my video, Being and Becoming, a Doctrine of the Two Natures, because it's key to it that all. Everything that becomes is not, all right? Can be, like humans that elevate themselves to God can become, but the process of becoming entails a sin to surpass. And water is the most dynamic, in this sense, frightening, powerful dynamism at the same time, right? Every moment simultaneously upholding existence through endurance, liberating by severing bonds and attachments, and annihilating whatever attempts to harden into permanence, thus perfectly mirroring the eternal cosmic rhythm of creation, preservation, and destruction that underlies all manifestation, right? It's a paradox. Centuries later, the German Lutheran mystic Jakob Böhme, our old sort of acquaintance by now, just like this series is pretty recent, but in any case, he's very famous, and he's also very strange in many ways, because if anything, just because he was a Lutheran, that's enough. But in any case, 1575, 1624, again, tradition degenerates. You find, however, these authors also in the Protestant world, of course, maintaining some of that. He was a shoemaker, by the way, so who knew better about matter, certainly lower thing. But sort of kidding aside, his profound visionary experiences produced, as you know, a body of work that profoundly shaped later theosophy, romantic philosophy, esoteric Christianity, articulating the identical intensity with unflinching directness. Quote, "The being frees itself from death through an agony which is accomplished in the great anguish of impression, which is the mercurial life," he says. This terror comes, he says, from Mercury or anguish of death. Right? This, notoriously enough, his most famous work, the Signatura Rerum, or the Signature of All Things, chapter 3, paragraphs 19 to 20. Published 1621. So you can actually easily find this text because they're obviously public. There is no copyright. It's a bit late for that, but they're very open, free access, open source. And in Böhme's cosmology, the Mercurial principle, I explained this better because we talked about Mercury already a bit, and it has a cathartic, sort of Holy Ghost purifying, spiritually powerful, but also potentially destructive fashion. It's just like the thunder before. The Mercurial principle manifesting precisely as existential agony, because the finite being must pass through the fire of its own dissolution, as we've seen it. And that's the process, paradoxically, which grace basically arrives, right? Because it actually stems from an achievement, an accomplishment that is active. So Böhme would have not perhaps gotten fully this as a Protestant, but in any case, this is enduring the full terror of annihilation, essentially, in order to die to death itself and be reborn into divine life. Every aspect of the limited personality is compelled to face its own extinction, an inner crucifixion of terrifying intensity before any authentic resurrection or higher integration becomes possible. And the source of this terror is, we said also what terror actually means. Terrifying comes from Latin, which literally means to make something earth, right? To reduce it to earth, basically to humus. Hence humans, for that matter. That's why they're so scared of everything. And the source of this terror is unmediated. It's a beautiful part of that, because it's divine power manifesting reality. It's unprotected, in contact with what the tradition repeatedly terms as poison as well. And remember, Christ really speaking of itself as the snake, right? The staff of Moses. Think about, Mithridatism, and the idea that you must, again, acquaint yourself with, it's like training a muscle, right? With weight. It's actually a traumatic process, but the muscle will grow accordingly if you do things properly. And so this mercurial power is a dissolving agent so radical that it operates exactly like metaphysical death, right? It fragments and pulverizes every finite structure, every differentiated essence. Remember, this is not material, right? It's not to say matter is evil. This is what Gnostics believed, right? This is not the point. This is both spirit and matter combined, and the instantiation in the lower nature being quote-unquote incarnation, but it's not separated from spirit, and the spirit alone is not what gets, in fact, rises to heaven once successful. It transfigures the body with itself, right? So that we're resurrected in the flesh. And so completely, by the way, this mechanism happens that no single trace remains of personal identity either, which is exactly the miracle of transfiguration, which is exactly how sort of Romulus in a blaze went to heaven, and there is no trace. So it would be problematic for finding, the remains of the personal identity of Christ after death, right? It would be really problematic, as much as this is present also in other religions, right? Especially the duodecim and Shias had very strongly this idea of the Imam literally disappearing at a moment because it's an imminent force. This is perfectly aligned. I mean, everything, like also the religions of the book are pointing this out, like in this idea of a connection, essentially, of the turns between Earth and those who live still in it, and even the nether world with the heavenly attainers that intervene from above. And so any, as we said before, sort of autobiographical memories, egoic boundaries, self-narrative, comforting illusion is what you can also measure in your life, something you surpass at some point as you age, as you mature, and as you achieve, as you are literally molding something else that really changes, that really transfigures everything. This is the total undoing of the separate, differentiated ego, a full conscious metaphysical death in which the self is stripped back to pure, undifferentiated potentiality, the naked ground from which all forms arise at that point, into which they return. The central, the form of forms, if you want, right? Remember that form and substance are quite sort of importantly different things, right? And what matters in tradition is, it's both, right? But it's a hierarchical principle where form, in fact, informs substance. And so substance alone is not really doing anything, right? That's also because, that's why, for example, materialism makes no sense to begin with. There's always an agency in how things happen. The entire communism being about wanting to destroy everything as opposed to create any form that they're terrified by. In fact, surprise, surprise, theologically speaking, does it remind you of anything? We're just saying. The central hermetic figure of Mercury, often explicitly called the philosophical basilisk, because like the mythical serpent whose gaze kills instantly, its action is lethal and instantaneous, is therefore consistently associated with the sheer violence of lightning. As we said before, recalling the thunderbolts Zeus used to overthrow, by the way, the rebellious titans in Hellenic mythology, in iconography, like really throwing, down the stuff. It's like a whack-a-mole. This terrifying potency finds a direct parallel in the Vedic tradition as well, where prana, the primal life force and breath of the cosmos, is described in the Katha Upanishad 2.3.2, one of the principal Upanishads of the Black Yajurveda, composed roughly between the 5th to the 3rd century BC or something like that, and as both and actually written down, but just from then, but from a much longer time, as both the quote supreme cause of terror and quote brandish lightning, right? Yet the text declares that one who truly knows it, withstands it, and integrates it without flinching or fleeing, attains immortality. Right? So that's the beauty. Again, like a moth into the flame. right? You have to receive that power. You have to be willing to self-sacrifice everything to receive grace. And that's actually the traumatic mechanism through which this happens. It's not adulterated. It's actually a matter of terrible manifestation. It's something that scares the hell. Like if you read in the gospel, the miracle of transfiguration, like the apostles sort of freak out, all right? And that was meant at the time because everybody knew at the time what that meant, by the way. We will talk more about this because it's really incredible. Even in, for example, in runic symbolism, notoriously, right? The connection with God is sort of the man. It's the same cross, actually, that the person that self-sacrifices to receive, right, with open arms, divine grace, and they die sort of mortal. It's the point of Christ, the entire thing. It's identical to all Catholic. There was only one religion at the time, right? It was only a matter of who attained it through what, right? And so Christ on the cross is dead but alive at the same time, right? And he never, because there is this suspense status before the Mors Triumphalis. Christ goes to hell, and then only eventually there's a resurrection of the flesh. And this is kind of obvious. Even if you think about the dynamic, it's all very simple. And all others, by the way, these are simply consumed by its overwhelming power. It's just like when you drink the soma. The soma is to the one that is not able to receive it. It's burning you, like you drink, I don't know, nuclear wastage, sort of, heavy water, stuff like you're done for, right? So there must be obviously some actual quality and merit and power behind that achieved. A striking mythic counterpart appears, because who does go against that without force, right? Without wanting that, and in that sense, surpassing that limit. It's not like, I don't know, you sort of step on a mine and die, and that is going to earn your place in heaven. That's not minimally. There is a minimum of action, but this is meant to be something much bigger, right? There's a striking mythic counterpart appearing in Mesopotamian tradition, for example, the god Marduk, sort of famous figure, also Merodach. If anything, we'll talk more about Semitic religion at some point. Chief deity of Babylon, by the way. So there you have also the Chaldean legacy of alchemy, etc. Wields lightning in both hands as his weapon while battling the primordial chaos monster Tiamat in the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. What matters meaningful enough is that symbolically this combat maps onto the alchemical stage that follows separation, because having divided and purified the elements, the initiate must now face and subdue the chaotic formless depths within himself, all right? Imposing cosmic order upon inner anarchy through the same decisive transformative violence that characterized the original divine victory over chaos. Right. So what we were saying yesterday, basically, it's you have, first of all, to acknowledge this differences historically. You have to have a clear mapping of reality in moral and scientific terms. And only at that point, you can basically understand what elements of your personality must be destroyed. I don't know, in general, you, how old you are. I mean, I actually have the analytics there. I have I have stopped watching the age groups and everything, but say mostly you are slightly younger than me on average, but we have, again, kids from high school, and God knows, I hope that there is nobody that is not an adult in theory, but say up to, in fact, people I've seen in their 70s beyond. Like, so I think everybody can relate by some degree in their lives how this mechanism works, right? How you build up, and how indeed there is an awareness of how this build up is somehow artificial. It's somehow not genuine, or at least if it is rigged by some dynamic or whatever, you're going to work to fix that, or it may simply return because it's something near, it's something like a tool again, or something that you can't simply get rid of so easily. There wouldn't be struggle otherwise. And in fact, it's at that point you have to realize that there is, and fight it to tackle. And so face your own demons and all this stuff, right? This is incredibly important. This is also a Jungian concept in many ways, but obviously it's inherent tradition. Now, the principle in question, therefore, bears an irreducible double sign or dual nature as well. That corresponds to the doctrine of the two natures, for that matter. It is at once death and life in inseparable unity, probably the entire extremes of absolute existence and complete non-existence. It wields the twin alchemical powers of solve, dissolve, break down, liquefy, and coagula. That is solve actually in Latin, vocative, and coagula, to coagulate, reunite, solidify, simultaneously and without sequence. Right? There is no safe transitional phase, no gentle gradient, no protected middle ground where one can pose. It's a total struggle. The destruction of the old form and the birth of the new occur in the same eternal now. There's no real, we'll make a bit about the traditional concept of time. There's no such thing like actually a time flow in the way we truly understand it. Everything is forever, a bit like the Nietzschean eternal return of the equals, right? And for this reason, it is called like the philosophical basilisk, as we were hinting at before, because it has this lightning-like suddenness. If you're interested also in the name of the basilisk, or it was also famous canon in the Renaissance, etc., like you see how traditional even certain terms really are. And there was all a zoology, like bestiaries, the old sort of natural scientific knowledge and metaphor at the same time in a traditional supernatural sense, burning up and reducing every quote imperfect metal, alchemically speaking, to ash. All right. For example, if you look at Oswald Kroll, roughly 1560 to 1608, this was a German Paracelsian physician, and meaning that he sort of had followed the schooling of Theophrastus Paracelsus, the famous alchemist of the previous generation, in his influential Basilica Chymica of 1609. It's a published posthumous cornerstone text of iatrochemistry as well. And this is also understood as a concept in alchemy as the terrible fountain that, if it erupts unchecked, brings utter ruin and madness, yet bestows supreme victory and kingship upon the adept who knows how to voluntarily immerse himself in its destructive regenerative flood. As you can see from Bernardus Trevisanus, Bernard of Treviso, the 15th century Venetian alchemist renowned for his allegorical treatises on the Mercurial Bath and perilous royal immersion. He worked at the Sforzas. There is sort of also an interesting manuscript tradition dating from this time. He's very famous at the time. We have already encountered him together with his other names. You have yet another important concept, one of Ruach, that is the divine breath or spirit, the, quote, indeterminate principle of all individuals, at least by Antoine-Joseph Pernetti. This was a Benedictine monk turned alchemist, and he wrote in 1758 this Dictionnaire Mytho-Hermétique. This is a major 18th century compendium. It's very useful, actually, to read, to study this stuff. Here it's easy to read because literally you have these voices, and he was an expert in the field. Interestingly enough, he was a Benedictine monk, and he put together like his immense knowledge on the topic, systematizing Hermetic symbolism in this vocabulary, this explanation. You go to the letter, to the word, and if it's just like an encyclopedia or dictionary. You have black lead as well, the plumbum nigrum. We will look better at all this also in a more strictly chemical or chemical sense. And that is at the same time magnesia, the quintessence. We talked about this in our last video about alchemy. It's essentially what stands out as the result of this transfiguration. In fact, in Greek, this is panenpasi, that is the all in all, the potency that yields philosophical gold and silver to whoever grasps and applies it correctly. Interesting level. Even silver, that is sort of still a lower stage, but obviously very much behind the attainment of humanity nowadays that is sort of stuck to the iron one. Even the bronze one is a big deal. And so the quintessence is one that sums everything, and it is inherently potential inside all of them, right? We've seen in the last episode how sort of deep in the abyss you have to search for that. And the last, by the way, concept is documented, for example, in Marcelin Berthelot's foundational Collection des Anciens Alchimistes Grecs. This is a late 19th century work related study of Greek alchemical corpora is attached. Because the descripted principle is by its very essence absolutely undifferentiated and prior to all form, by the way, because form applies in that sense to a finite reality as well, right? It is used to project, as we've seen, substance to a higher level, but essentially it belongs only to the lower nature. The higher nature is at least an absolute form that is boundless in its power, right? And so it's a full transcendence of it all. And so the form can be also a bigger one, like as you augment yourself. And the symbolic nomenclature is for this reason employed to designate that the principle knows virtually no bounds. Hermetic authors state this explicitly as well as repeatedly. Also because by the time of alchemy, so at least alchemy is very old, millenary, but say in the Renaissance period when all this stuff was being essentially collected, it was essentially expressing a sort of critic on the, let's say, what these ancient authors really believed about it. And so everything points out the commonality of it. It was good advanced philology at that point. Like it was a pretty, like these people spent their entire lives reading stuff. So everything formed quite clearly in their minds. And this is the main point, that the all, the everything, that is the primordial one, can be referred to by literally anything. Any object, creature, substance, myth, or absurdity, precisely in order to confuse, mislead, and repel the unworthy, the profane, the unprepared. That's why we do on Schwerpunkt what we do, for that matter. If you don't get it, if you don't destroy yourself, you can't get this, right? It's a beautiful poison, right? While simultaneously revealing its hidden unity to those who have eyes to see through the contradictions and multiplicity. This is no accident, right? It is a deliberate initiatory strategy of protection and revelation. Do you realize when or why I say, we have to talk about this in another video. We already talked about this. I'm not going to repeat myself. According to you, why have I made 2,700 videos, right? Who wants to understand this? I'm not saying it, but who wants to understand this understands this. Now, when the texts intend to highlight the annihilating, on the other hand, destructive aspect of this undifferentiated potency, they deploy terms such as poison, viper, universal solvent, philosophical vinegar, aqua regia, beautiful, or corrosive fire as well. This contrast in the latter aspect is quite fascinating because the solvent, the vinegar, okay, everybody understands the acid, the acetic acid. Aqua regia or corrosive fire is, interestingly enough, like you could switch them, right? You could have corrosive water and royal fire. You understand how they are, because aqua regia is the transfiguration of the woman, as we said before, and corrosive fire still, like the destruction of the element that is impure, right? Impurified. And they stand together. You understand how entwined they are, how not separated they are, right? That's why Gnosticism is also, well treated by burning people at stake, right? Now, any structure, any differentiation, any achieved form that comes into contact with it is instantly and irrevocably destroyed. The ego, with all its scaffolding, cannot endure. It shatters and collapses into sheer formless potential. Yet, and this is the crucial paradox, the identical principle is simultaneously honored, as we've seen, under names that emphasize its generative, life-giving aspect. The menstruum, literally the symbolic monthly blood, or generative fluid of the archetypal woman that nourishes and feeds all becoming. The fountain of living water, as we've seen before, the life in bodies that which attracts the light of lights, drawn from, this is all from the aforementioned transliterated Syriac alchemic fragments preserved in Berthelot. In the second volume, this is from 1893, but in any case, you can't find this all. You can't quite read it if you don't know the Syrian script. You have at least Berthelot that translated it for you, transliterating it as well. But, it's complicated. Now, the very potency that dissolves and kills is the same Womb-like matrix from which immortal, incorruptible being eternally springs forth. And that has to surpass that same dimension in order to win. The maternal birth, think about the Parsifal, right? You have to slay the dragon, to slay the Great Mother in order to save her, all right? And become bull of your mother, literally, in the ancient scriptures. Son and father of your mother. As we were just saying, this principle is embodied above all in the serpent or dragon archetype. The Catholicos office, as it's called by Hippolytus in his Philosophumena 5.9. Right? Interestingly enough, Catholicos, obviously, meaning universal, and the Catholic, therefore, cosmic serpent that walks through all things and permeates every level of existence. Again, Hippolytus is actually describing what the Cathars are, the Gnostics are describing, but because in any case the concepts were the same, as you know. This dualist heresy is routinely rebooting across different millennia, because it's always the same archetypal issue, right? With just few declination in the moment. And remember, Hippolytus is defending there, and he's perfectly aware that Christ is the Catholicos office as well, by his own word, by the way. Also, the igneous dragon of chaos that conquers and devours all forms is described in this dual sense, equally. By, for example, Irenaeus Philaletus in the Introitus Apertus ad Occlusum Regis Palatium, chapter 2. This is actually a much later text, mid-17th century English alchemical one under the famous pseudonym. That was, however, talking about the red dragon, the red horse as well. Red has to do with solar deity powers. Just the other day we were talking about how destructive angels that kill everything they touch in Parsifal. The knights were. You had to be able to master both powers at the same time, as we explained before with the royal water and the corrosive fire. It could have not been otherwise, and he would just take a direction or another, does not understand that. Just like Parsifal's mother, by the way, was trying to hold her son back from not making him become a knight as well in the Arthurian Legion. This is the same Ouroboros serpent explicitly identified with leiosis, that is, the grinding down, dissolution, pulverization / smoothing of bodies, which obviously has to do with the composition with animals, or the tectonic element par excellence, devouring corpses, but in this sense also, purifying sense, as we've seen in the Proserpina myth, etc. In ancient mythic archetypes of the primordial force, whose nature it is to destroy every fixed form precisely so that eternal regeneration and renewal can occur without end. This is the cyclical samsara sort of chthonic Pelasgian kind of mentality, and there is a higher orderly principle. Naturally, all these correspondences and images draw upon the deepest, most primordial strata of human symbolic heritage, stretching back across civilizations and millennia. The waters, also known as the radical moisture, if you think about this, our world, how it works, that's a point. The woman of philosophers, that becomes, in that sense, also the Sophia, but it is so sacred wisdom as she's possessed, but that is otherwise primarily primordial chaos, but in this sense also an all-encompassing one, the Anto-Pan, the all/one, the mystery sought for aeons and finally found, to sound a bit Gnostic. All these expressions converge upon and designate mercury, understood not as a mere chemical element, but as the fundamental substrate of existence, the prima materia, the origin, the operative principle, and the ultimate telos or goal of the entire great work, right? Because Mercury, in this sense, is the one who actually changes the thing. The chemical text insists over and over, for example, that everything is composed of mercury, or mercurial water at least. It's a type of water that can vehiculate the same mercury. It is the matter out of which all arises, the agent by which transformation occurs, and the perfected substance into which all returns, right? And an ancient archetypal linkage evident in mythologies from Mesopotamia to India to pre-Hellenic Europe binds the feminine principle inseparably to waters, the earth mother, mother of waters, great stone, womb, cavern, house of the mother, night, house of the depth, house of the force, house of wisdom as well. So you understand how dual the principle really is. Hermeticism does not invent this connection. It revives, deepens, and perpetuates it with extraordinary intensity. The primordial feminine is simultaneously the fertile womb from which all manifestation emerges, and the devouring abyss into which all manifestation dissolves and returns, the eternal source and the eternal end. Zosimus of Panopolis, active in the 4th century, the early 4th century AD, one of the first historically named, by the way, figures in Western alchemy, and a Hellenic Egyptian practitioner whose surviving fragments interweave practical laboratory recipes with profound visionary mystical commentary, unequivocally affirms, quote, without the divine water, Theon Udor, divine water, sulphurous water, however understood in this broader concept, deliberately polysemous, at least in alchemy. So the divine is obviously from Theos, so God and sulfur brimstone, to stick to sort of the alchemy, alchemical references. Nothing exists. Uden estin. Whatever is formed or compounded from it, in the compound, it performs every operation. The Hellenic term theon is deliberately polysemous, playing on the homonymy between divine, from theos, from the deus, Indo-European divine being, and sulphurous brimstone, the burning, purifying mineral associated with volcanic and tectonic forces. Why is that the case? Well, just read Genesis. What is sort of lingering above waters with God? It's the Spirit. That's Mercury. That's the Christ. That's the Holy Ghost in the, at least, medium between man and God, between humans and the human and the divine, say better. And it's obvious that everything is going to be permeated by that, right? The divine sulphurous water, remember we said before, corrosive fire, Aqua Regia, right? Check that video they made about the Ars Regia. And so what the patres were able to officiate through it. This is the point. The mercury, this divine sulphurous water, is the supreme agent of both destruction and regeneration, because it's the link proper. It's, as we said before, the sulfur, the red, the symbol of sacred royalty, of those who eternally rise as the king of the living, the ones who struggle in this place distant from both God and men, right? It's all incredibly metaphysically coherent, right? It's that suspense status, again, between death and second judgment, resurrection. That's the mystery of life itself, right? In a human fashion. And nothing could have come into being without these principles. The alchemical literature is saturated with equivalent or near equivalent designations: water of the abyss, and Abyssaion Udor in this Hellenic ancient text, mysterious water, divine water, permanent, living water, or water of life, eternal, water silver, right? Arguroides, Udor, or similar. Ocean, our sea, great sea of the philosophers, water spirit, fons perennis, the perennial fountain, right? Perennial spring. You see how God's grace is infinite, and it can always emerge if you do the right thing, right? Celestial water. Just thinking in that sense, also the thunder's godfather is also the god of rain, that ingravitates the earth, and so participates actually to it, and it's truly the universal moist. Dozens more, all pointing to the same all-encompassing, all-penetrating, transformative potency that simultaneously annihilates form and gives birth to the incorruptible. The initial and foundational task of the work is to stabilize the chaos aspect, and so ordering this reality, giving form to substance, as we've seen, Antopan, the old one, the undifferentiated totality. This stabilized chaos is, properly speaking, the prima materia that we were talking about before as well, the pure formless possibility. So the truly transfigured one, the root principle and substrate of every possible generation. Because without this core, without this embryo, this potential, there can't be even the enactment of the same. The ground of being prior to any differentiation, distinction, or manifestation whatsoever, the origin from which every form proceeds, and the goal to which every form ultimately returns. We've seen this, interestingly enough, also in the video about Janus, Bifrons. The symbolic vocabulary for this principle is extraordinarily rich and varied, yet remarkably consistent across time and culture, constantly drawing from the shared mythic heritage of ancient civilization. It is called night, so the primordial darkness before creation, the dawn of that, and the darkness better just before the dawn. That nothing is darker as before the dawn. Abyss, the bottomless depth. Matrix, the womb. Tree, the cosmic axis where poison and elixir meet. Woman, mother, woman of philosophers, even goddess of marvelous beauty, whose exquisite appearance conceals a power that is lethal to the unprepared, as described in pseudo-epigraphic works attributed to Basil Valentine, cited in Johann Jacob Manget's monumental Bibliotheca Chemica Curiosa at the beginning of the 18th century, one of the great collections of alchemical treatises. Now, interestingly enough, this symbol of the tree, as I said before, is also the one of nature, Mother Earth, that is, as you've seen, burned, transfigured by the thunder, that bears fruit, that bears energy, and as you've seen also in the videos about the sacred monarchy, like medieval German folklore, the resurrection of the king, but also in the video about the Indo-European heaven in Virgil Ford's Eclogue, is what probably the Golden Age refers to, this eternal divine power that pours from this burning, from this continuous feeding, let's say, of the burning as well, with new tree, right? And so with this new growth that is sort of repeatedly spreading other power around it, and this can happen like in the myth of the Rex and the Morensis, of the golden bow, right? Throughout all tradition, think about Inez, think about, again, the preeminence of the tree, but as a foundational element of all peoples. Think about the Yggdrasil, think about, the same oak, Capitoline tree. And in the Bible, the oak is sacred for that matter. And this is the archetypal feminine principle at its most profound, right? Its beauty, masking lethal transformative potency, the very center of the cosmic tree where the paths of destruction and immortality intersect, just like the symbol of the axe and the cross. The axe is the same thunder, so this strikes the tree like the fasces, and at the same time the cross is the shifting of the axis, so the transversal axis of man towards the height. As we've seen, there is a continuity in Catholic tradition, also from pre-Christian to Christian times, in that same symbolism. Very few people know this. Yes, the cross is the fasces, is the battle axe itself, but in any case, this profusion of symbols, the two most precise characteristic and recurrent designations throughout the entire medical chemical corpus remain water and mercury. These two, above all others, most fully and faithfully express the essential qualities of the principle. It is because it really belongs to the lower nature anyway. So you essentially have a Trinitarianly speaking, the two elements that interact in the lower part. Naturally, mercury is also a medium of God, so you have, as we've seen, the same sulfurous water, and that's why you can exchange the two concepts. By the way, so the different names. Its absolute fluidity, its corrosive and penetrating action, its generative and resurrective capacity. It flows without ever stopping, dissolves every fixed and rigid form it touches, drowns and extinguishes the old self in its depths, births the new from the very act of drowning, annihilates every illusion and attachment, and never, under any circumstances, ceases its, in fact, ceaseless, by definition, operation. In the clearest, most straightforward language possible, what Hermeticism and alchemy are truly describing beneath all the veils, riddles, and Baroque symbolism is a deliberate, voluntary, fully conscious confrontation with the raw, undifferentiated primordial source of all existence, the formless chaos, the infinite potential, the groundless ground, and prior to every differentiated thing, every form, every self. This confrontation manifests internally as an encounter with a poison, a lightning bolt, a terrible water philosophical basilisk that compels the ego to undergo complete dissolution, total metaphysical death in full awareness. Those who are unprepared will cling, resist, or flee, are destroyed outright, consumed by the very force they cannot integrate. Those who are prepared will endure the terror without retreat, without collapse, without any attempt to preserve the old self, succeed in integrating the opposites. Solve et coagula, death and life, chaos and order, dissolution and regeneration. They emerge, reborn into a state of unified, boundless, immortal awareness that transcends the illusion of separate selfhood entirely. All your limits preclude you, this force, to be fully unleashed. The notorious difficulty, obscurity, and deliberate impenetrability at some point of alchemical and hermetic texts are not accidental flows. They serve multiple interlocking purposes. Historically, they provided protection against persecution, whether from religious authorities, church or inquisition, who viewed such teachings only in part as heretical, magical, or diabolical from secular powers suspicious of anything that challenged established orders. That's mostly the point. Most of this was all a Catholic tradition, right? So there wasn't much about it. But of course, if a Protestant starts to sort of use this in different ways, like, it's the problem of the doctrine there, not of the pre-existing traditional essence of this. They also functioned as an initiatory filter, by the way. Only those who had already begun the inner process, who had tasted something of the dissolution through dreams, visions, crises, or spiritual practice, could begin to pierce the veils and recognize the unity beneath the contradictions. We made the last video about alchemy was dedicated to this dissolution to the quintessence through just earthly death, but not sort of real death, chemical mortification and soul detachment, terror, transformation, and spiritual ascent. That's the title of the video. And it's obviously connected with the same identical thing. Finally, the opacity of these texts reflects the ineffable nature of the experience itself. Like, again, if you have already experienced this mechanism, you can understand what this means in life. And so this is just like a manual guide to it, just to answer again yesterday's question. But it's you who has to repeat what has learned. Language inevitably fails when attempting to describe a state that lies beyond subject-object duality, beyond language's dualistic structure, which is fallacious as that, right? And that's the point. There was no dualistic heresy in here. This was the purest imperial Catholic traditional theory, body doctrine, if properly taught correctly. The tradition could give, like modern scholarship, whether historical, studying the transmission of texts and practices, psychological, especially Carl Jung's interpretation of alchemy as a symbolic map of the individuation process, Nigredo as ego dissolution and confrontation with the shadow, Albedo as purification, Rubedo as integration and wholeness, notoriously comparative, noting parallels with shamanic ordeals, right? Mystical sort of dark nights of the soul, psychedelic ego death, or near-death experiences, or anthropological viewing it as a continuation of ancient mystery traditions, regardless of sort of the quality of these experiences that radically varies, has done much to, if anything, for some people, demystify the literal surface and reveal the profound psychological and spiritual dynamics echoed within that are nevertheless the entire point of these texts. And there are, in their explicative mechanism, absolutely clear. In order to access this, you have to initiate, right? And then you can purify, and then you can integrate into the higher level. It's a process. You see, it is, as we've seen, the four status, like the process of individuation, corresponds to the same Trinity. We explained it in a also earlier video that was the one. Wait a minute, I give you the title directly so that it was clear, like spiritualizing the fixed and corporealizing the volatile, this Trinitarian unity in Diana's Silver Rebus. As a matter of fact, it is an important work, but the video I was talking about was the triadic structure, the tria prima, of soul slash sulfur, spirit slash mercury, and body slash salt, right? That tells you there, like the actual mechanism in all of it. Yet, even with these clarifications, the core demand of tradition remains as uncompromising, as radical as ever. There is no gentle path, no intellectual shortcut, no safe bypass. Right? One must be willing to die fully, consciously, willingly, and without reservation in order to be truly reborn. And that's why warfare is the place of election for such attainment. And that is a mystery in and of itself, but truly experienced by those who go through that. That is the eternal, unflinching message hidden for centuries beneath layers of symbolic protection, waiting for those with the courage to look directly into the abyss and not to blink. This is, in any case, very important step. Let's say, in Schwerpunkt, you see, alchemy took a while before taking off as a subject discussed here, but we are really getting to the point, and this is going to be very propedeutic to also other and earlier actual body doctrines that explain the same thing, the very concept. But you understand how relevant, how important this mechanism really is. Reason for which, however, we'll see much better where this all gets to. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.